So our last talk of this session is from Darlene Lim, and she is going to be speaking on considerations toward building inclusive analog work environments.
So the title of our talk is Considerations Towards Building Inclusive, Safe Analog Work Environments. And so I think the first word is really what I want to stress that I'm putting forward today on behalf of myself, all the co-authors that are listed in our abstract, and that hopefully I'll be able to show you in a couple seconds through the slides. And then so many other people, colleagues, that I've managed to have the privilege to work with over the years. So these are considerations. It's food for thought. It's definitely not meant to be a prescriptive thought, a prescriptive presentation, but rather a starting point for a conversation that has been ongoing, of course, in our community, and that we wanted to share our thoughts on, and then to hopefully facilitate going forward so that we can evolve as a group, as a community, and continue to get some amazing work done together in the most inclusive and safe work manner possible. Let me just back up and acknowledge the co-authors on this particular presentation here. But again, I just want to stress, this really is a roll-up of thoughts that have come in over the years through experience, through reading, through conversations around how to, consider and to think about building towards this inclusivity and safety within our analog work environments. So Mike, if you don't mind, please going to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So very quickly, this is me. I've been working in the field of analog research for many, many years now, and now actually have the joy of taking so much of that learning and applying it to a flight mission. I'm the one of two deputy project scientists for the Viper mission. But really, I show you this slide too, because the considerations that we put forward have been from the many hundreds of people that I've had the joy of working with over the years, on land, underwater, pole to pole, and everywhere in between. And so I just want to make sure that representation of ideas is clear as I proceed through these slides, or as Mike rolls through them for me. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. And your dog is so cute, Mike. So just to start us off in terms of a framework of where the co-authors and I would like to begin, first of all, of course, we know there's no perfect analog, but analogs are so great at helping us to solve problems, as we've heard about through the series of talks today, and of course at many different conversations and conferences. And they're really well suited to address issues that pertain to environments and targets beyond our planet. And field programs such as analog missions involve multidisciplinary participants from around the world. And we only, if you think about it, we only get to meet once or twice a year in person under the dynamic, intense, and demanding conditions of the field. But the rest of the time, a lot of times we're working remotely with a broad team. A lot of times we're only getting together, a few times through that year to solve problems very quickly. So it's a very intense work environment, which is fairly interesting and important to acknowledge. But it's really when these multidisciplinary teams transition into an interdisciplinary whole that the magic starts to happen, the innovation, the exciting kind of intrinsic motivation that can get a team into an incredible state to solve some very difficult problems. But this transition, as we'd like to put forward as a consideration, it's really a non-trivial endeavor, and it requires a lot of thought, a lot of intention, careful and clear intention, preparation, and execution, particularly with the objective of building towards an inclusive, holistically inclusive analog work environment. Let's go to the next slide, please. So as we've put in our abstract, we'd like to put forward the idea that structural equality and inclusion within an analog field program, it can really be advanced within the broader community if we take note and we recognize stakeholders, who they are and what they need, and that we also recognize the importance of leadership reflexivity. And what that means is asking yourself as a leader, whether you're the PI or you're anybody in a team, from a leadership perspective, what is it that you can do to improve, to ask yourself the questions of whether or not you are actually enabling the environment that we hope we're building towards, inclusivity and safety. So in terms of defining what a stakeholder is, we see it as anyone, any group, any entity with an interest or concern in the execution of an analog program. And so each stakeholder is fundamentally of importance to consider, to understand, and ultimately to include and inspire for the overall success of any program. And in terms of leadership, we feel very much that the creation of equitable and inclusive analog field programs does require at least one person, such as the PI and relevant leads, to be responsible and accountable for the work structure, the team well-being, both in and out of the field, and broader programmatic and public outcomes. This may seem very much like common sense to many of you, which is fantastic, but we feel that it's very important for at each at-bat, the leadership to reflect on this and to wonder if, in fact, these are goals that they're working towards. Next slide, please. So who are stakeholders to be considered? So for example, they can be stewards of the analog sites. So we find very much that if an analog team visits a land or a water field site, typically our presence is ephemeral, but the impact of our presence on that site can be indelible in maybe a positive or even a negative sense. And so really taking into account these stewards and the needs and considerations of these stewards and gatekeepers to those regions is really important to do from the get-go. So for example, these types of stakeholders can be community leadership, Indigenous councils, township officials, park managers, and regional businesses. And in terms of actions for consideration, we find that, for example, well in advance of the mission start, we like to identify and meet with these stewards to really focus in on their sensitivities and their codependencies with us, with the goal to work towards a mutually supportive and enabling relationship. And another action for consideration is to communicate the importance of being mindful of these sensitivities to the entire team early, often, and just in time. So well before we get into the field. Next slide, please. So another stakeholder, as an example, and of course there are many stakeholders, we're just putting up a few for consideration, is the analog research and field team itself. So those who are participating in the team, and each of these stakeholders has the requirement to feel safe, to be safe within their workspace. And this safety can be defined as their ability to perform their research and to retain their individual dignity and identity throughout their work experience with the team. So some actions for consideration is establishing a decision-making principle, a set of decision-making principles that are clear, that are repeatable and dependable when the project needs to grow, pivot, react, or realign. So as an example, we have typically put forward these principles in order of priority of safety, environmental stewardship, and then reaching our research goals, and aligned all of our decision-making to these three mantras. Another consideration is to establish a very clear and dependable mechanism for discourse around concerns associated with safety, environmental stewardship, and research goals, and to communicate, again, these processes early and often and just in time, and to provide training, retention mechanisms, and feedback opportunities, and of course, throughout this, hold people accountable. Next slide, please. Another stakeholder example are funding, those stakeholders that are funding your work. So for example, federal agencies, universities, special interest organizations, and et cetera. And so this is important to underscore as well, to really highlight the importance of professional composure throughout the research process. And of course, there are many, many others. But in all cases, we find that it's important to recognize and to connect these internal and external stakeholders to each other, to the purpose and vision of the program. Next slide, please. So in terms of leadership, we brought this up as well in our abstract as a consideration. And so these are many questions that are here recorded and that I'm happy to share. And I think we've also put and written into our abstract. But the leadership towards building an inclusive work environment can be enabled by reflecting on and defining these questions and many more. So what are the core values of the analog program, all the way to what are the anxieties and barriers to progress that exist within the team? What additional support will be needed to enable our team to thrive, and other things such as, what are my strengths as a leader? What are my weaknesses? Am I in need of being friends with everyone? Do I need everyone to like me? And what could I improve from my last at-bat? So very personal questions. And we know this from experience, and we also know this from the literature, that principal investigators, as you see in this citation here, have the greatest power and responsibility to steward these field sites. So really the leadership is such an important aspect of enabling the inclusivity and the safety. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide. Thank you. And so one other consideration is to look at the possibility of being a multiplier instead of a diminisher, as an example. So as I'll read from this quote here from an article in the Harvard Business Review, most companies are adept at bringing in smart, talented people, but very few companies put as much discipline into understanding how fully they can utilize that talent. And so many managers are focused on their own ideas and capabilities, so much so that they shut down the intelligence around them. And so these are considered diminishers. But the leaders that seem to amplify the intelligence around them, these are considered multipliers. And I think this article is very relevant to what we find in our analog teams, where we have such capable, remarkable people, and we want to bring them together and really amplify that intelligence to get to the innovation. Next slide, please. So some quick considerations, and Mike, I'm going to get you to just kind of click on that button real quick. But one of the things that we really try to enter into all of our programs with is that when we go into the field, as an example, it's a place of work. It's not a summer camp. And so there are very comprehensive safety plans, workplace guidelines, participant responsibilities, and codes of conduct that we tend to put forward at the get-go, again, early, often, and just in time. Next slide, please. Other documentation that we will issue in the pre-mission or the pre-field deployment period are reporting schematics in case something happens. We want everyone to know that there is actually a process and a protocol and accountability that we will put forward to mitigate, as well as to report out any safety issues that may come to light in any way, shape, or form. Next slide, please. We also have many safety plans that we put forward over the years, for each and every deployment, not just for each analog mission, but for each deployment within those missions, safety flowcharts and so forth, that really have, we've tried to really learn from some of the incident reporting that other communities, such as firefighters, and fill in the blank, many other communities use in order to ensure that there's process and protocol and accountability in their search to generate a safe environment. Next slide, please. As well as after the field deployments, we're very careful to go over what happened, to conduct a lot of debriefs, and also, during the mission itself, as we start to wrap up, we actually have to-dos and a lot of protocols to ensure that the sensitivities and that the intrinsic motivation to maintain the workspace environment as being inclusive and safe is there right to the very end as people go home, and then that transitions into our work, day to day as a team, even outside of the field. Next slide, please. We also, of course, from a research standpoint, establish a very common professional lexicon, because, of course, as I mentioned, it's the trick is taking a multidisciplinary team and turning that into an interdisciplinary team. So to do so, you want to make sure that you're having conversations where one person is not, overwhelming the other with terminology that is not understood, because that can very much hamper the progress and the innovation that we're searching for. So this can go back to, establishing research traceability matrix and offering a real Hansel and Gretel way back, to what we're trying to do when conversations get hairy, as they often do in these very complex missions. Next slide, please. I want to let you know that Elise and Lauren out of the USGS ran an incredible, terrestrial breakout session where they asked myself and Jacob Richardson to talk about inclusivity and safety in our work environments. It was a 45-minute session. We provided the opportunity for anonymous input to come in around questions of inclusivity, safety, and harassment. And there's a lot of information that came in there, and I've summarized it quickly, some of the high-level elements on this slide and the next, but we are going to be putting out some roll-up of the learning from that particular session in the coming weeks. But we asked the entire community the questions such as, how does it feel to be included? And fundamentally, everyone said, well, it means that I'm trusted. And then we also asked them, how does it feel to be excluded? And fundamentally, what it came down to is, I am lesser than. And then similarly, we asked about how the community defines a safe work environment. What are signs of a safe work environment? And they talked about, thematically, clarity, transparency, a diversity in terms of the leadership, solid training, and trustworthy leadership motivated by the group's best interests rather than their own. We asked them as well, what are signs of an unsafe environment? Very interestingly, drinking came up as the #1 issue, or a very high-level issue, as well as disorganization, misguided leadership, and a lack of accountability, and so forth. We asked them as well about harassment and how do you define harassment? Being ridiculed, chastised, forced into non-professional activities like drinking when you do not want to, not being taken seriously, and so forth. So you'll see many of the different components of what people felt they wanted to share that day, and they were reiterated again and again, even in that very short period of time. So I think what's important in terms of a takeaway from this slide is that there are themes that many people in our community feel very similarly on the same issues. And then others are surprised, but are, this is a way for us to put forward these thoughts and to generate conversations which are hopefully going to move us to a productive endpoint. Next slide, please. Final thoughts.
I was just going to ask you to start wrapping up so we can move to discussion. So it's perfect.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Elise. Thanks. So my final thoughts to share is that, I just want to put forward that this is a very North American presentation. We have others from around the world who, of course, have joined us, particularly at this NESF. But the management practices, leadership style, sensitivities, and so forth, they will certainly differ around the world, but there are undoubtedly common cross-cutting themes that will bind our analog research programs, globally. And so, we hope that we can put forward these considerations, that this will help to facilitate and enable conversations so we can find similarities, differences, and nuances together, to explore them together, and then we can act upon our collective interests to grow and develop the analog community. And so we all very much look forward to continued conversation. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Elise.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Darlene. There was a lot in there. That was very interesting and very important topics.